Good morning.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Tori. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing really good. I am feeling rested, which is a nice thing. Yeah, midweek, I'd say. How about you?
That's a treat.
I know, right? That's how I feel about being rested. It's like delightful.
It's such a nice treat. Yeah, I slept. Actually, I've been sleeping a lot. For whatever reason, maybe the transition into spring or something. But yeah, I got a deep, full night's sleep last night.
Good. Yeah, I think that the Sunday time change it wrecks me usually for 2 days, so I get kind of poor sleep. It's funny, you wouldn't think an hour difference would really make that much of a difference, but it's the waking up is so different, and then it feels like your biological triggers in the evenings are just so, shockingly it messes with you. So then I get tired, and then like usually 2 or 3 days later I just crash, and then I just kind of rejuvenate. So
yep, understood.
Hey Ashley.
Yeah.
Welcome.
I think I'm going to try to pull this up on the computer. For whatever reason, it's deciding to be slow today, so I'm on the phone right now.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Cool. Yeah, take your time. I think we'll probably have a few more rolling in.
Yeah.
I will see if I can share about it. Ashley, where are you coming from today? Are you on the East Coast? It's your afternoon. Maybe you're just listening, in which case, all good. Oh, you're in Detroit. Nice. Okay. I've been hearing the coolest things about Detroit these past few years, just this total renaissance revival of art and food and culture and like restoring historical buildings and landmarks and repurposing them into just like absolutely thriving cultural spaces. Been really curious to get over to Detroit. Like where you're from afar.
Yeah, it's sort of the that Renaissance, sort of the opposite of big box and strip malls that seems to predominate these days.
Definitely. Yeah, I live in Southern California and grew up, born and raised here, and that's one of my biggest, as I've gotten older and seen, traveled to other places, that it feels like there's a stronger layer and texture and like from the root culture in a place. Where I live is just it feels just like washed out, like strip malls and just like cookie cutter houses and not even a ton of art, which, not to bag on it, you have to seek it out and like find it, and I'm still here because there's amazing people, but it's funny how like place can really inspire or like kind of just not be a breeding ground for that in some ways.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's California used to have its such an identity. And I guess you still see that in San Francisco and places like that. But yeah, it's unfortunate that sprawl kind of tends to do that. It's not very imaginative or creative the way sprawl happens. So,
yeah, it's all about quickness. Hey, Steve. Welcome.
All right, looks like Zoom's going to work on the computer. I'm going to switch over here. Hope it's not too clunky.
Cool.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Good. Antonio, I'm just going to post in the live chat to see if there's any folks online who maybe didn't know about the event. But then whatever feels right to you, we can get started. But Ashley and Steve, I think I might have met you at some point before. I think I definitely have. But Ashley, it's really great to meet you and have you here today. We've been having these community conversations for the past couple of weeks. And if you guys read the event description, it's pretty summarized in there, but the intention behind it is just to create some space where it's really like let's not bring in an expert and have it be, you know, a speaker talking to an audience. Oh, Ashley, good. Glad you just joined. That's awesome. I'd love to hear what brought you in. So I think a lot of these webinars, I'm personally like, some of the speakers are so amazing, but we're about a year in now, right? And it's like a little bit of Zoom fatigue, a little bit of, you know, it's such a treat to feel the expertise of someone, but I think there's also so much power and ability to just like drop into real conversations like this and have a little bit of like a more intimate space to just like all bring our own perspectives and questions. And even if that's a beginner's mindset, I think there's a huge advantage to bringing that and really like putting that up on a flag and owning that too. So trying to create just, you know, 45 minutes to an hour where people can hold that and yeah, just chat it out. So Antonio, through one of these conversations, we've had a few around like land stewards, around food as medicine, around kind of the convergence and intersection between, okay, cool, between rural and urban spaces. And after all of them, it's like, what do you guys want to talk about? Like, what's another topic we could spin up and, you know, deep dive on? And Antonio is has read a couple of Eric Toensmeier's books, who I think one of them is carbon farming. One is, he's just doing a lot within the permaculture space. He's a contributor to the Drawdown project as well. So Paul Hawkins' group, really focused on climate solutions. And it looks like he's really sitting at the intersection of agricultural possibilities and interactions with those climate solutions. So yeah, Antonio is, I would say, you know, the deep dive expert. So Antonio, whenever you want to jump in and kind of set context for us, and then we can all gather around and chat about it. I'm stoked for this. Thank you so much for raising your hand and wanting to share what you know.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really eager to see where this conversation leads. But you know, I'm here to kind of put my finger on the pulse and see what, you know, where other people's thoughts are on this topic. You know, I had a couple thoughts on how I jump into this, and I'm probably just going to do something pretty organic. Looks like a nice, small, intimate group, so we can probably have a lot of interaction and thought exchange. So I think it's probably helpful. My background here, my entry point into this movement, like so many people, I have a story. I come from a background in competitive athletics prior to around 2008 was my deep immersion into biodynamics, and decided, you know, it was definitely one of the older interns when I've done my internships, decided that I was going to craft myself into a biodynamic farmer. And I still have a lot of heart in the biodynamic community and movement. I would say my more recent influence have been permaculture, and I think I see regeneration as a tangent off it, or a 2.0 kind of iteration off of the permaculture movement, particularly for its, you know, its desires to scale up and also address ecological issues through we can think of regeneration as a form of agroecology. And of course, regeneration is a very general term, and it can mean something very different. I have a tropical cacao farm. It's a cacao agroforestry farm in Costa Rica in the wet tropics, and then home is western slope of Colorado, which we're coming off a couple of really bad drought years. So I see pretty varied extremes in climate and ecosystems in these two spots. But the kind of my come to Jesus moment on this project was the realizing that what I was good at, what I came to be good at, what I've really found I was passionate about were perennial growth systems. And as it turns out, as I did more and more of the deep dive into what agroecological systems are the most efficient for carbon drawdown. Of course, that's the hot button topic. And, you know, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm very squeamish about carbon markets. I'm somewhat reluctantly embracing the idea, seeing its potential, but also, you know, I think it's a space that we have to navigate with a lot of care, caution, precaution, and, you know, eyes wide open. And I can speak more about that if anyone has questions later. But you know, in this book that Eric Toensmeier wrote as one of the academic contributors to the carbon, excuse me, I'm going to say Carbon Underground. That's Tom Newmark's organization. Tom owned the farm that I interned on in Costa Rica called Finca Luna Nueva, which is where I fell in love with tropical horticulture. No, the project I'm thinking of is a Project Drawdown. I know I'll get it out of there eventually. And a lot of the data, this book actually contributes to a lot of that data. And of course, you can go online and see they just published a couple more recent white papers that I just read through. So they're cycling through their information. Even some of this is, you know, it doesn't contain several of the studies that have been conducted recently by Savory Institute, but, you know, we're really seeing amazing results from holistic grassland management. But I sent out a graph. I don't know if people had a chance to look at it. I think it's a really powerful one, and I probably should have. I guess I can do screen share here, can I? Maybe. Anyway. Not to worry, just to keep the conversation flowing. It turns out that our annual cereal cropping systems kind of predominate, you know, the farming as we know it globally is really unsustainable. I'm going to pull up this graphic because it is just such a good one. That'll give me a moment. I'll do that while I'm talking. So the thing about perennials is we have to think of them as systems that do very minimal soil disturbance. And actually, I'm going to double back here. I have this open, and I wonder if I can share it. It is worthwhile. I'm going to read a definition of succession. If I can first find the page. It's over here somewhere. There it is. So ecological succession, for those that aren't familiar, I'm just going to give you a straightforward Wikipedia definition, ecological succession. So when you think of annual cropping systems, think of a system that is being held in early succession in perpetuity, artificially. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more deeply. This is just the Wikipedia definition of succession. Looks like we don't have, oh yeah, we do have this. You just, looks like Tori, you've disabled screen sharing.
Oh, here. I can make you a co-host and then you can screen share.
I'll start reading that in the meantime. Great.
I think you're a co-host now. Yeah,
that was quick and easy. So let's share that screen. And here it is. Super. All right, so I'm going to navigate over here. This is just Wikipedia. So ecological succession is the process of change in the species structure of an ecological community over time. The time scale can be decades. For example, after a wildfire, and I can certainly relate to that, living in the Western US. Not sure where the people are calling in. If there's anyone from Australia, you should know your way around wildfires. Or even millions of years after a mass extinction. The community begins with relatively few pioneering plants. In this case, think annuals, or even weeds are pioneer plants, and develops through increasing complexity until it becomes stable or self-perpetuating as a climax community. The engine of succession, the cause of ecosystem change, is the impact of established organisms upon their own environment. A consequence of living is sometimes subtle and sometimes overt alteration of one's own environment. It is a phenomenon, a process by which an ecological community undergoes more or less orderly and predictable changes following a disturbance or the initial colonization of a new habitat. Succession may be initiated either by formation of new unoccupied habitat, such as lava flow or from a severe landslide, or by some form of disturbance of a community, such as fire, wind throw, logging. I would add the plow to this, and I think you can kind of see where I'm headed with this thinking. The succession that begins in new habitats uninfluenced by pre-existing communities is called primary succession, whereas succession that follows disruption of pre-existing communities is called secondary succession. So what you can say about modern industrial farming is that it operates on this principle of early disturbance. Every time we're plowing or applying herbicide or pesticides into a field and promoting its growth for oil seeds like canola or soy, grains like wheat, rye, barley, corn, even rice, and rice kind of falls into the same category. The farmer is, even with some crop rotation, it's pretty artificially calibrated toward early succession. And what we understand about succession, and really this is the regenerative movement too. We use this technique in regeneration. For example, I have some establishment crops in Costa Rica. I have bananas that are fast maturing that are establishment for, and I can even show a picture of that actually, probably if I go to my photos here. Let's go to my favorites. Here we are. Here is an example of, where did it go? Actually, I'll pull this one up next. Actually, this is the graphic, but I'll head over to this. So we have early successionals established in this mixed-use perennial polyculture, which is cacao agroforestry. And as it turns out, the reason I hedge my bets on the wet tropics near the equator is, in terms of carbon drawdown potential and ecological restoration, it's an accelerator. Way out over here, this represents carbon sequestration potentials in a cacao agroforestry system. Now that means—
Can you zoom in a bit? Is that possible? Sorry,
say again?
Can you zoom in a little bit? I just can't see it.
Oh, yes, I will. Thank you. I will do that. Give me a second. I should. Yes. All right. Zoom. Where are we?
It might be, right above your mouse right now, like the little plus and minus. You click out, and then by the back arrow, there's like that plus and minus.
Oh, here it's up. No, wait a minute.
Yeah,
there you are. My
yeah,
bad.
There we go.
My bad.
Sorry. Yeah, okay. That's perfect.
Yeah, there we go.
That's better. Yeah, that's better. Cool. Thanks.
So, cacao agroforest. Now, understanding that 90% of global cacao currently is not even shade grown, let alone shade grown, which, more about that, that's cacao evolved as an understory crop, so it likes the dappled sunlight of the canopy. And that is really its optimal ecosystem. There, if people are interested, I can explain why Europeans came and opened up the canopy. It was to give an initial boost in production, but that has proven pretty deleterious. So now we can come back and kind of rethink how we plant. I plant 500 cacao per hectare as opposed to 1,000 to 1,200 trees per hectare. But it's in a mixed use perennial polyculture, which does a number of things. It optimizes that system, optimizes the health of that system, also creates a diversity, and it's an accelerant for carbon drawdown as well. So this, going back to how succession works, as I switched this it was a macadamia farm 40 years ago, and then it's kind of been fallow, but managed organically for the last 40 with some cattle and some brachiaria grass, which is a tropical jungle grass. It can be, I don't want to use the word invasive, but it is allelopathic. So it does have the potential to choke out trees when you're putting them in. So we use, going back to succession, we use a successional strategy to establish more mature woody systems. So the thing to understand about succession is that nature's inclination is toward rising complexity. That's her impulse. If anyone's ever read The World Without Us, I think that's addressed pretty significantly when the human footprint is no longer evident on nature, then nature takes over and she kind of resets. So, I think what we find ourselves in is, I haven't seen the data, but I'm going to look for it after this because I had this thought come up last night. I believe that the level of disturbance, global disturbance caused by industrial agriculture, and that means exposing soil. Think of the plow, and you think of bare soil as a form of ecocide or genocide on the microbiota and microfauna of the soil. We're living in our day of reckoning from all that biological collapse that's being promoted at the hands of industrial agriculture. So, in comes the regenerative farming movement. There are a lot of folks that kind of, I'm more of a farmer entrepreneur, but entrepreneur, did I say that right? Entrepreneur. And I think of myself as sort of straddling these worlds where, okay, let's figure out how to make this practical. So Eric Toensmeier is among these academics through Project Drawdown, et cetera, that are calling for a global perennialization of the food system. Now, you imagine the implications of that. And I'm going to probably hand it off here shortly to just hear opinions on what it means to live without beer, bread, and pasta. To tell people. Oh, please.
I'm curious, just to jump in. Yeah. What do you mean by global perennialization? Like, what would that look like?
Right. So that's a great question. So essentially, to perennialize means to replace staple crops with stable perennial staples. And there are a lot of them are things you've probably never heard of. Now, macadamia potentially could be one of them. And it's one that that I'm very interested. It's a really high quality, high fat tree nut. But actually, let me pull up while I'm at it. I'll give you a list of. Here is this is my potential perennial plants for my grow zone in Western Colorado. But let's go over here. These are just my field notes that I use when I'm on the farm. These are a few different forms of cacao, and it should be noted too that cacao actually, and there are quite a few more subspecies in this, or not subspecies, but varietals or land races, heirlooms, hybrids, etc. But in Theobroma, there are multiple subspecies of Theobroma that aren't too far deviated from cacao originally, interestingly enough. And these all represent, nutrient-rich foods of the tropics, potentially, that could be grown in, these mixed-use perennial polycultures. Now, I alluded to before, like I include notes and and photos in a lot of my field notes. And this is really for my own working purpose, but this is a Mexican sunflower. We use this as a chop and drop establishment crop. It builds the biomass. It's an early establishment crop. This is crotalaria or sun hemp. It's nitrogen fixing. Fish bean is nitrogen fixing, but also can be cut back so that those nodules release the nitrogen into the soil and we get the benefit of biomass. The beauty of doing this type of key lining and contouring in the tropics is my slow site has never seen a machine. We did this all without soil disturbance because things grow so quickly. We're actually building swales from the top down without a backhoe. And that would be a lot harder to do in a temperate climate. But, it's just.
We have a few questions coming in, and I want.
Oh yeah, let's do it.
I don't want to cut you off, but I want to have time for conversation too. Do you want to pop off of screen share, and then we can just be in the gallery view and all see each other? Greg is curious. I think Greg actually had two really great questions, but just to follow exactly what you were talking about before, he was asking if you could talk about how perennial agriculture can sustain a complete human diet with nut trees, fruits, annual vegetables going to seed, and using animals, etc. And are crops suitable in different climates? It's in the chat if that would be easy.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I'll pull it up and look at it while I'm addressing that. So a couple thoughts come to mind. That's such a brilliant point because we've adjusted to, well, interestingly enough, industrialization has pared down our diet in terms of the variety of foods compared to, what more of our indigenous ancestors ate. Now, of course, that would be very specific to a bioregion because, the globalization of the diet is a very new phenomenon. So to answer that question, yes is the basic answer, Greg. And this book addresses it. It's not super accessible. It's super wonky. But if you geek out on that sort of thing, I'd highly recommend it. It's Eric Toensmeier's Carbon Farming Solution. On their website, they also address some of these interesting. Some are known. Some are not well known. For the temperate climate, for example, a lot of the names that come up are things like hazelnut is a real champion in a temperate perennial agroforestry system. I would actually, steer toward a silvopasture kind of hybrid system where there are livestock and there are perennial, perennial berries and nut plants. So yes, another book that's super accessible and a wonderful, fascinating read is Mark Shepard's Restoration Agriculture, where he's done this very thing in Wisconsin, and I call it temperate climate agroforestry.
Is he talking about? Because I think, at least my knowledge, I didn't know Mark Shepard was talking about the human diet piece. I think that was a really interesting piece. That he does. Yeah, Denise was asking too. Is there a way to keep some grains? Because I think that's, to me, is super interesting too. Like, how do we make a human diet off of perennial crops? But then, realistically, I feel like people at this point, grains are such an integral part to our diet too.
Right. So it's a hot button topic. It can even be triggering. I've found, like I said, you start telling people that your beer, bread, and pasta may be a thing of the past. They get a little cranky. The interesting thing is, though, there are a lot of perennial substitutes for oil seeds in the form of tree nuts, for starchy starch substitutes, things that you can bake with. I think the thing about gluten-free diets right now is that it's driving a lot of food products into a lot of creativity. How do you create these substitutes for people? And there are enough people on gluten-free diets that I think that will help promote this movement. You could even suggest that, and this is this is just opinion, but you could suggest that the collapse of the system, it's interesting that it's sort of running simultaneously along the change in public health, gut microbiomes have devolved, etc. Anyway, rather than that, I feel like I'm blathering on about that. I do recommend Mark Shepard's book. He does a lot of nutritional analysis. He's some of the first attempts that I've seen personally at calculating nutrition per hectare or acre, nutrition per acre versus yield per acre. That's a whole other side topic that makes it really challenging. For example, 500 cacao trees per hectare. I can't even get a loan in Latin America. They don't know how to do the metrics on yield expectation, yield outcomes. So even the financing around this is really challenging. And yet, we are in this global epoch of ecological ecocide on behalf of the soil. And, so what's the bold steps that we need to take? My choice was to look at the opportunities to normalize some of these novel foods. We're growing things like jackfruit and breadfruit and bread nut and, not just Theobroma cacao, but Theobroma cupuaçu, which is related to cacao and
That's fascinating because Antonio, you're a farmer too. Like the piece that's really interesting to me, Greg brought up another good question, like while this transition potentially is happening, or while farmers are experimenting with shifting to more perennial crops, and as they're becoming established, like what can farmers or land stewards do in those first few years, either from like a building soil or an income perspective? I think that's super interesting. I don't know if you had.
That's a great question. Yeah. That's the key right there, isn't it? I mean, yes, I think for a farmer in the temperate climates, especially if you're lucky enough to have a wetter climate than we do out here in the West, here, honestly, I think it's all about livestock. And
so like managed grazing and kind of like helping build and break down the soil. Got you.
Yeah. I mean, that's the disturbance, if you will, that heavy traffic of megafauna, frankly, that were larger than our current megafauna. I mean, if we're using cattle as megafauna, they're not even as heavy as bison were. And we had woolly a lot of this soil was established by, bison and camels, which are, male can be 2,000 pounds with huge feet. We're talking about a lot of animal traffic and a lot of dung and a lot of inference of fertility, which has been lost and segregated. I would even argue that I have argued that barbed wire was the most destructive invention of the 19th century. We could offline about that, but nutrient cycling is everything. And farmers are now challenged to take our little subdivided plots and imagine, how we can cycle nutrients through that system to, optimize its health. And I think really that's the pinnacle question for for agroecology. I would say, if it was Greg that had the question, if you have land, then I would just experiment. I would perennialize a section of it, maybe where that impulse is already really strong. And sometimes that's in the drainage areas and these awkward, like my sweetie's, her dad's land. He's got 15 acres out in Montrose. It's really arid, but he has year-round water flowing through one part of his land that just has right now her horse copper on it, and it needs more livestock, but it's full of brush and it's craggy and but life wants to happen there. And it's these early emergence, it's Russian olive, and everybody's like oh, this damn Siberian elm around here. And I look at that and I think, well, work with it. You know, that's your coppice, that's your biomass. There's an incredible opportunity there, I think. Anyway, let's
dig that. Yeah.
Let's go into the question.
I'd love to actually, I mean, I think those are a few questions that came through. Ashley, I know you're popping in the chat, so I don't know if anything's coming up for you or Steve or Dennis or Denise or Greg if you had any follow-up questions, but I think as we're waiting, maybe folks will unmute or have some questions.
Well,
what do you think of Denise?
I did put them in the chat, and I apologize for being late. So hopefully you haven't already said this, but what was I saying? I said, oh, I noticed that Dennis put something about planting what I consider grains. Is there? I kind of was wondering, is there a way to still have some of these grains and do the like, how does that, because I'm always coming from a place of the middle, you know, not the absolute over here and the absolute over here. Is there a way to kind of start a farm where you're still, because really, I think that where the diet got, just an opinion, where our diets got off is when we went too far in any direction, you know, too far with the grains, too far. So anyways, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I typed in the chat actually.
Oh, you did?
Yes. Yes is the short answer. And the, you know, sort of the, I have personally seen, visited some friends' farms. Like there's a friend in Costa Rica that has a small, and he's a Tico farmer. This is based on, you know, this wasn't borrowed from, oh gosh, I'm thinking One Straw Revolution. It'll come to me. Anyway, this is Tico farmer utilizing a lot of traditional techniques that have been, you know, around Mesoamerica since pre-colonial. But he's managed some small scale rice that is, you know, that would be more carbon neutral. It is wet rice, but he's running aquaculture through there as well. So it's a much more interesting and alive system. You know, I think when you talk about, I picture boutique systems. I picture intercrop systems. I picture smaller scale grain harvesting, probably more heirloom and variety of grains. And, you know, I think we need the diversity, but as well as, you know, in all aspects. So yes, I think annual cereal cropping can be part of a regenerative future. One Straw Revolution, thank you. But, you know, when 95% of global rice produces methane, and nobody wants to talk about that, they just want to talk about farting cows. You know, and cow farts can be reduced dramatically with improved pasture fodder. That's being demonstrated in real time. And then systems that are evolved perennial pasture lands manage via methanobacter, manage a lot of that methane output. And, you know, the new data is rolling in that there is that net zero. And in fact, that as that fertility increases, like Gabe Brown gave a presentation a couple days ago, he's getting, compared to his neighbors, he's getting 20x, like 20 times water storage capacity in his fields than his North Dakota neighbors.
I can get us several dates.
Yep.
Oh,
someone jumped in. Is there a question?
No, I think he just accidentally wasn't unmuted.
Oh,
got it.
I also put on there, and thank you for the description, Tori, that came from Wikipedia. But the whole carbon thing, so, you know, talk to me like a kindergartner. So if I'm understanding correctly, some of the crops that we the current system are causing more pollution. If I'm, this is how I'm breaking it down, and just let me know if I'm off track or whatever, but causing more pollution where what we could grow is something where it actually takes the carbon from the air and brings it into, like it brings the cycle, the circulation better. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes.
Perennialization? Okay.
Yeah, let me, I'm going to pull this for, because we kind of, I navigated away from here kind of swiftly. I'm going to go back to this graphic here. There we are. So can everyone see that? It's I love this graphic because again, it reinforced, I'd already invested heavily in learning cacao cultivation before I ever saw this, but this was very affirming to see this number all the way out over here on, this is a drawdown potential of 40 metric tons per hectare per year. Like, wow, right? Tons, I think he's using metric tons. I go back and forth, you'll forgive me, I go back from metric to imperial all the time. So sometimes I get a little stuck. Spanish to English, colones to dollars, metric to imperial, it's a little maddening. So based on this, these are woody polycultures in this example, woody crop monocultures, woody biomass monocultures, tree intercropping, herbaceous monocultures, if everyone can see that. Livestock systems, this one's really interesting because really we don't get into temperate until we're over here, right? So this is intensive silvopasture plus timber. That would mean, some tree species, either for, in this case, it looks like primarily timber, but you could have mixed use. You could have fruit woods, for example, that also produce fruits. Nuts are also possible in the system. But the silvopasture really amplifies that carbon drawdown potential. And when you think of carbon drawdown, think of a concentration of plant colonies really optimizing their photosynthetic genius, literally vectoring CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting into soil. Now, the reason we're so excited about this is solar panels can't do this. That EVs can't do this. Their green energy, if it ever gets to a level of perfection, could achieve a theoretical net zero carbon, but it's, there's still more carbon being dumped in the atmosphere. And I get, again, as I said before, I get a little squeamish around overemphasizing on carbon because there are at least six total ecological outcomes that are verifiable that my farm in Costa Rica can perform, and I'm as interested in those as the carbon. And if it's there, it's reforesting. I'm adjacent to a 50,000 acre rainforest preserve, and my farm has a potential to be contiguous to that rainforest, even attracting in, doubling its habitat, attracting in wildlife that can be used in a system like this. So, we're really shifting how we're thinking. In Colorado, I voted in favor of reintroducing a formal reintroduction of the wolf, with very mixed feelings, because it puts the pressure and the onus on ranchers, unfortunately.
Denise, I love that, Antonio. I think also what you're talking about with silvopasture, that integration of like animals and trees. Denise, did that answer your question about like the carbon piece? I think to me, like kind of in like the elementary version of what I understand about carbon farming, which is again pretty elementary. And I'm gonna stop the screen share so you can just see everyone. But it's like keeping like what Antonio was saying originally around the disturbance piece of succession farming. Tilling, I think, does that a lot. So that's kind of a small understanding that I have around how tilling rips up the roots. And then if there's not roots in the ground, plants aren't doing their job to like hold carbon into the ground. But really, it's just like living cycles. Plants are taking in carbon and releasing oxygen. So if their roots are getting ripped up on a year-over-year basis, like annual crops, then there's that piece of they're not within that natural carbon cycle, Whereas perennials, I think perennials come back naturally without human intervention for at least 2 years in a row. So there's a little bit more potential for them to be drawing down carbon in that sense. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
Love it.
I didn't, actually Denise can answer it, but if she was able to see on that graphic at the bottom, I was working my way down toward the bottom, annual crop, even no-till, and these are forms of agroecology, even no-till is maybe theoretically slightly better than net zero in terms of its carbon drawdown potential when you compare that to a perennial system. So yeah, it can, and you know, that to me, when the word that pops out when I see that graphic is sustainability. You know, and I got involved in this movement when sustainability was the buzzword, and then there was this aha moment where we suddenly realized, holy, you know, we're in the middle of a mass extinction. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I'm sure people here are already aware of that. In the middle of a mass extinction, you know, we're committing industrialization, committing ecocide all over the planet. Is sustainability even a possible? You know, it's not enough. You know, my come to Jesus moment again there was like, holy cow, it's not enough. It's not enough to grow our own food and plant vegetables. Something seriously got to shift here. And so, if you know,
I mean, that's the.
If we're talking about net zero gains, then you know, net zero gains are incremental when we need to be throwing Hail Marys. I think maybe I'm wrong. You know, I'd love to hear what other people think about that.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time too. I know we're about 3 minutes over at this point. So yeah, if there's any closing thoughts, what's going on, Steve? Do you have any feedback?
We're a small farm, 100 acres here in the Finger Lakes of New York. And the way we've integrated animals is we have a rescue farm animal system. So that's where we get our manure. I guess we could let the donkeys go trample out on the fields once in a while or something like that. And the goats do finish off some of the corn fields and some of the millet fields. And we also have a hawthorn orchard, which I want to ask you about later, Antonio, some other time when we have more time.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we're one of the only here in New York State. It's like there's one down in Cornell and there's one here that was naturally occurring because of, you know, they used to grow hamburger in this field, and now the only thing growing that was left growing is the thorny hawthorn. So, it's actually a magnet for warblers and also the haws and different benefits that we get from hawthorn.
Well,
A very interesting discussion. Thank you. Where in Costa Rica is your farm?
So yeah, I'm in Colorado right now, but my farm in Peonia, Colorado, which is on the western slope of Colorado, and then my cacao farm is just outside of La Tigre, which is about 30 kilometers south of La Fortuna. So a lot of people who've traveled to Costa Rica, you know, La Fortuna is a hot spot. It's the adventure capital of Costa Rica.
And my daughter's down there now, and we lived in Cerro Plano for a while.
Oh, awesome! Wow, yeah. That's great. But New York is intriguing. I mean, it'd be great to offline on that discussion, because you guys can do things that we just simply can't on this side of the country. You know, with higher moisture levels and more perennial diversity, more deciduous, natural deciduous forest. That would be a really fun landscape to play with. Honestly, like bring in some chestnut crosses. There are some Chinese chestnut crosses I think that are doing well. You can do hazelnut. I'm sure you probably do pawpaw in New York.
Yep.
Which is an interesting re-emerging fruit. I'd like to try some of that on an irrigation system here, but out there, boy, you get a field day.
Well, we're far enough north that we have to be very selective as far as the microclimate for pawpaw. So
What's your zone?
We're at 5 and 6. Yeah.
5 and 6. Okay. Yeah.
Because we're so close to the lakes and the Finger Lakes. Yeah.
So you get that lake effect then. And, yeah, hawthorn is really interesting. It's you know, as I understand, I live on a medicinal farm here in Colorado, owned by the Colorado School of Clinical Herbalism, or the recent owner of that. But yeah, it has some medicinal properties as well that could even prove commercially viable, I would guess, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So many varieties too. So many that undescribed varieties, as far as yeah, just like apples, we really don't know. We can't. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. You know, I think this revolution can inspire a lot of fledgling plant nerds to do the deep dive into rare and unusual, and you know, various heirloom varieties and land races, things that would. This could be a real seed restoration revolution. I hope. I mean, let's find out. I'm focused a lot on cacao varieties, but wherever we look, there's a lot of diversity just in my companion plants with the farm in Costa Rica, and I'm always intrigued when I hear of something new. And every day there's something I had, you know, something out of Africa that had a traditional use, and suddenly it could be, you know, it could be. I'm not a believer in a single savior. I think we need a lot of diversity here, but there are some cool plants. You know, hawthorn's one of them.
Talking about that,
good, guys.
What you guys are talking about New York and Colorado. I'm in Arizona, and I'm planning on heading over to Florida. But I do also think about how do you make it work in Arizona, and what I keep coming up with and just thought is, you know, go to the Native Americans. What did they do? What did they do before colonization? And because I'm like, that, like, we got to bring that back. What did they do? And that's really where how you say, you know, starting up different communities in different areas. That's where I am as far as my Arizona community. But I don't know how. I was just wondering if you guys already have connections with somebody that's already doing something like that, or. And you mentioned the college. I was like, I wonder if ASU is doing anything like that. So, yeah, just wondering if you knew of anything like that.
We have Ganangadon here, which is a Seneca establishment, and they're actually growing a white corn that was grown by the Native Americans, and certain select farmers are growing it. So they come to your farm and plant and then harvest, and it's all harvested by hand. And it's now on the market. It can be purchased.
That's great.
If you Google Ganangadon, it'll pop up, and you can get it over through the mail and that type of thing. But it's becoming one of their major income sources to support their support the local tribe, the Haganan tribe.
I love it. Yeah, that reminds me. That reminds me, Steve, of in Mesoamerica, our region of Mesoamerica, Pujagua, which is a blue corn, and Atol are a couple of traditional heirloom varieties of corn. And it may sound like I'm anti-grain. I'm cautious around grain, and I mostly don't eat grains. It's just proven more effective for my health, and legumes I don't even tolerate. So, you know, it's for whatever reason, that's a whole side discussion. But interesting to note that when you're talking about these heirloom varieties, the white corn, the Pujagua, the Atol, you know, blue corns, for a lot of people, they're less reactive. People that have food sensitivities to industrial yellow corn or, you know, conventional hard red winter wheat, you know, hear this story. And more often than not, I have a similar experience myself when I eat blue corn. You know, it's not a reactive food. And I'm not going to say the word allergy, let's just call it sensitivity, food sensitivities. You know, the more we get away from industrial diets, buy from small farmers, you know, that are doing boutique crops, that's huge. You know, the piece of this where, you know, there's an opportunity to perennialize some of those staples, it certainly intrigues me. And it works for my business model as we, you know, plantain rice, for example. I've had plantain rice and it's great. It's really nice rice substitute. I like it better personally.
I think it'd be interesting maybe to ask a question to the community, like what perennials are you guys growing? I'll do a question after this and see if there's, I'd be really fascinated to hear like what boutique farmers are growing, or if there's gardeners who are intentionally, you know, planting perennials, or where that goes. So I love where this conversation is evolving too, kind of around like what you shared with the Ganongadon. Is that how you say it, Steve? Like this heritage seed saving, and how do we start to revitalize the biodiversity of our food system? And to your point, Antonio, I think perennialization like holds a huge space in that, because, you know, we have shifted so much to like annual crops. So we're having a conversation next Tuesday at 9 a.m. Pacific, so at noon Eastern for you guys on the East Coast. And that's going to be focused all around that topic of seeds and cultural renaissance and heritage seed saving and projects that are going on. So if you guys want to tune into that, it feels like we're kind of naturally evolving in that way. So I'll drop that link so you guys can check it out. Antonio, thank you so much for bringing your knowledge and taking us through that graph and some of your pictures. It's such a treat to get a chance to kind of deep dive and unearth some of the embedded wisdom that you bring to this through your stewardship of land. And I just really appreciate you bringing up the topic and kind of stewarding this conversation. It was so fun for me, and it feels like lots of great questions came through. So appreciate you guys. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know we're a few minutes over. So I'll wrap it there. But again, thanks so much, Antonio, and thank you guys for popping in.
Tori, a closing thought. If it makes sense to reach out to Mark Shepard, is a really wonderful speaker and teacher. And I think this could, you know, I'd love to see this conversation evolve, and someone who's successfully done it for a few decades in Wisconsin.
And would you say because what I know about Mark, I didn't realize that he was looking at his cropping systems instead of yield as like nutritional potential from it. I love that. What I knew more about his work was that water management piece, because I know he's really worked with like some of the water, like preservation and conservation management. So Kevin Maher, who's actually in the community, works really closely with Mark. And he's on my short list. I'm trying to hold balance for like bringing in like diversity around who we're having come speak. And I haven't even reached out yet, but I love that. It's good to get like a +1 on like Mark Shepard's wisdom would be really valuable, and like a cool person to conversate with. So I love that. Thank you.
I would enjoy that also, especially that you brought up that he speaks about the water, because that's another thing that as a witness in Arizona, I'm like, what are we doing? Oh my gosh. What? Oh my gosh. You just let it go away. I'm like, So I would love that.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Big thanks across the board. You guys have a beautiful rest of your Thursday. Here we are, cruising.
Thanks so much, Tori.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.
Adios.
Cheers.